Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily dose of what's hot on Hacker News. Yesterday was absolutely packed with fascinating discussions. We reviewed 30 stories and picked out the 5 that really got the community fired up. We've got everything from open source rebellions against walled gardens to mind-bending photography techniques, and even a dramatic breakup story between a developer and their M1 MacBook. What I love about today's selection is how it really captures this moment we're in, where developers are pushing back against platform lock-in, rediscovering old technologies with new twists, and questioning whether we really need to pay premium prices for premium experiences. So let's dive right in with a story that perfectly encapsulates the spirit of creative problem solving that makes the Hacker News community so special. All right, shifting gears here to something that's caught fire on Hacker News. We're talking about Manim, the animation engine for explanatory math videos. You know those absolutely gorgeous math animations from 3 Blue 1 Brown on YouTube? The ones where calculus concepts just flow into existence and suddenly make perfect sense? Yeah. That's all powered by Manim, and it's got the community buzzing with 391 points and some really fascinating discussion. So here's what's interesting. Manim was originally created by Grant Sanderson, the genius behind 3 Blue 1 Brown, as his personal tool for making those mind-bending math videos. But it's become this whole thing. And I mean that in the most dramatic way possible, because we've actually got a bit of open source drama here. There are now 2 competing versions of Manim floating around, and the installation warnings in the documentation are basically screaming, please don't mix these up. You've got the original Manim GL, which Grant still maintains for his own videos, and then there's this community fork from 2020 that just calls itself Manim, no GL. The community version came about because, well, Grant built his tool for Grant. He needs it to do specific things for his specific videos. But the community wanted something more stable, better tested, friendlier for beginners. Classic open source tension, right? The creator's vision versus what the masses actually need.
What's really catching my attention in the comments, though, people are going absolutely wild about how well Manim plays with AI coding assistants. Multiple users are reporting that you can basically just tell ChatGPT or Cursor, hey, animate a visualization of the Pythagorean theorem. And boom, you get production-quality mathematical animations. One commenter said they're using it for all their presentations now, just throwing prompts at an AI and getting back these beautiful, precise animations that would have taken hours to create manually. But here's where it gets spicy. There's this user, Ishkebab, who's calling out what they see as a fundamental design flaw. They're saying the whole library suffers from quargzitis. Everything's keyword arguments with no type annotations. For non-programmers listening, that's basically like, imagine trying to assemble IKEA furniture, but all the instructions are just vague suggestions, and you have to guess what goes where. It makes the code harder to understand and use, especially without AI assistance. The community seems pretty split on which version to use. Some folks are saying, look, if you're not Grant Sanderson himself, just use the community fork. It's more stable, it's got better documentation, it's designed for regular humans. Others are sticking with the original because, well, if it's good enough for 3 Blue 1 Brown. What really strikes me is how this tool has transcended its original purpose. People in the comments aren't just talking about math animations anymore. They want this for everything. General infographics, data visualizations, motion graphics for presentations. There's this hunger for programmatic animation tools that aren't locked behind Adobe subscription wall or require you to click and drag for hours. And honestly, the timing couldn't be better. We're in this moment where AI can write the code for you, but we still need the right tools to execute that code. Manim sits perfectly in that sweet spot, complex enough to create professional animations, but structured enough that an AI can understand and generate the code for it. The fork situation, though, it's such a perfect microcosm of open source dynamics. You create something for yourself, it becomes popular, the community wants to take it in a different direction, and suddenly you've got competing visions of what the project should be. The warnings about not mixing up the installations, using different package names, Manim GL versus Manim, it's like watching a family feud play out in pip install commands.
What's beautiful is that both versions can coexist. Grant gets to keep his tool exactly how he needs it for creating those incredible educational videos that have taught millions of people advanced mathematics. Meanwhile, the community gets a version that's more accessible, more stable, maybe less powerful in some ways, but more practical for everyday use. It's messy, sure, but it's also kind of perfect. Everyone gets what they need. Speaking of open source alternatives and breaking free from walled gardens, that theme continues with our next story. But this time, the stakes are even higher because we're talking about liberating not just code, but potentially millions of games and the kids who play them. All right, switching gears from our last topic, have you ever wondered what happens when developers get fed up with a walled garden? Our next story is about Librebox, an open-source Roblox-compatible game engine that's causing quite a stir with 245 points and some pretty heated discussion on Hacker News. So here's what's fascinating about this. Librebox isn't trying to reinvent the wheel or create yet another game engine from scratch. Instead, they're doing something almost subversive. They're building an API-compatible alternative to Roblox that lets developers take their existing Luau code and just run it somewhere else. It's like someone said, hey, what if we could take all those millions of games trapped in Roblox's ecosystem and set them free? Now, before we get too excited, let me be clear. This is very much in the demo stage. We're talking basic functionality here. Scene rendering, lighting, shadows, the instance system, and support for those classic Roblox data types like C-frame and Vector3 that any Roblox developer knows by heart. But here's the kicker. There's no networking yet, no servers, none of the multiplayer magic that makes Roblox, well, Roblox. The community reaction is, let's say, it's complicated. You've got one camp that's absolutely thrilled about this from a preservation standpoint. One commenter made this really poignant comparison to Flash games, pointing out how much creative content is essentially trapped on the Roblox platform. And they're not wrong. We're talking about potentially millions of games and experiences that could vanish if Roblox ever decides to pull the plug or change their terms. Then there's this whole other dimension to the discussion that honestly surprised me with how passionate people got: child safety. Multiple commenters are explicitly supporting this project because they see Roblox's handling of child safety as problematic. One user straight up said they refuse to let their kids use Roblox and would love an open source alternative where they could have more control. That's a pretty strong statement about trust in the platform. But not everyone's buying it. There's this wonderfully sarcastic comment from a user named Glitch, who basically said, yeah, good luck with that. It's the Robux that matters, not the engine. And you know what? They've got a point. Roblox isn't just a game engine. It's an entire economy, a social platform, a discovery mechanism. Can you really replicate that ecosystem just by cloning the API? Another interesting perspective came from Dr. Pangloss, who asked, why not just remake the good Roblox games in Unity or another established engine instead of building a whole new compatible engine? It's a fair question, right? If the goal is to preserve or liberate content, why maintain compatibility with Roblox's specific way of doing things? What really strikes me about this project, though, is the strategy behind it. By maintaining API compatibility, they're essentially building an escape hatch for Roblox developers. You don't have to learn a new engine, you don't have to rewrite your code from scratch, you just point your existing work at a different runtime, and boom, you own everything. No more giving Roblox their cut, no more content moderation policies you might disagree with, no more terms of service changes that could destroy your business model overnight. Of course, and I have to mention this, there are some potential legal landmines here. The discussion thread touches on this, but doesn't really dive deep. How much of Roblox's API can you replicate before you run into intellectual property issues? The project description is pretty sparse on these details, which has some commenters questioning the transparency and long-term viability of the whole thing. The timing of this is interesting too. We're in this moment where developers are increasingly wary of platform lock-in, where we've seen what happens when platforms change their rules, whether it's Unity's pricing fiasco, Reddit's API changes, or Twitter's everything.
There's this growing appetite for open alternatives that you can actually control.
But here's my take. Even if Librebox never becomes a full Roblox replacement, even if it stays a demo project that can only run simple games, it's sending a message. It's proving that these walled gardens aren't as impenetrable as they seem. It's showing that with enough determination and reverse engineering, you can build alternatives. And sometimes that threat alone is enough to keep platforms a little more honest. The real test will be whether they can build out those missing pieces, the networking, the server infrastructure, the social features. Because right now, as one commenter put it, this is more of a neat technical demo than a viable alternative. But hey, every revolution starts somewhere, right? Now, from liberating games to teaching graphics programming, let's talk about another educational platform that's trying to democratize a complex skill, though the community has some strong opinions about how well it's executing that mission. Story 3. Shader Academy. All right, so here's something that caught my eye on Hacker News today. Shader Academy, learn computer graphics by solving challenges. Now, this one's interesting because it really sparked quite the debate in the comments, with about 235 points and 60 people chiming in with some pretty strong opinions. You know, learning shaders has always been this kind of mystical art form in computer graphics. It's one of those skills where you either get it or you spend hours staring at code wondering why your sphere looks like a deformed potato. So the idea of a challenge-based learning platform for shaders, that should be a slam dunk, right? Well, not so fast. The concept itself is solid. I mean, we've seen how well challenge-based learning works with platforms like LeetCode for algorithms or Code Wars for general programming. Taking that approach and applying it to shader programming makes total sense. You get immediate visual feedback, you can see exactly what your code is doing, and there's something really satisfying about getting that perfect render after tweaking your math just right. But here's where things get messy. Multiple users in the comments are pointing out that the site looks, well, let's just say it has that unmistakable AI-generated flavor to it. You know what I'm talking about. That generic, slightly too perfect styling that screams, I was made by ChatGPT's default CSS suggestions. One commenter specifically called out the textures and overall design as looking like they came straight from an AI prompt. And honestly, that's not great for first impressions, especially in a field that's all about visual excellence. What really got people fired up, though, was the apparent lack of acknowledgement for the giants whose shoulders this platform is standing on. We're talking about completely ignoring resources like ShaderToy, which, if you don't know, is basically the YouTube of shader programming where people share these mind-blowing visual effects in tiny amounts of code. And then there's Inigo Quiles, or Iquiles, as he's known online, who's basically the Bob Ross of shader programming. This guy has created some of the most comprehensive shader education resources out there, and not even a mention? That's rough. It's like creating a physics education site and not mentioning Newton or Einstein. The technical issues aren't helping either. Several Firefox users reported WebGL problems, which is pretty concerning for a platform that's entirely dependent on WebGL working properly. I mean, if you're building a shader education platform in 2024, cross-browser compatibility should be table stakes, not an afterthought. But here's what I find fascinating. There's this interesting debate in the comments about whether we even need to learn low-level shader programming anymore. One user, Bob1029, made this compelling argument that for most practical applications, you're better off just using built-in shaders with baked lighting. Their point was that unless you're doing something really specialized, the time investment in learning custom shader development might not pay off compared to just using what's already available and well-optimized. And then, okay, this is kind of hilarious. Someone discovered that ChatGPT can apparently solve the puzzles on the site, which, if true, kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a learning platform, doesn't it? It's like having a math homework site where a calculator can just give you all the answers.
Though I guess you could argue that understanding why the solution works is still valuable, even if an AI can generate it. Look, I think the core idea here is good. We need more interactive ways to learn graphics programming, and gamification can definitely help make a traditionally intimidating subject more approachable. But execution matters, especially in a field where the community has such high standards and where there's already a rich ecosystem of learning resources. If you're going to enter this space, you need to either do something genuinely novel or at least acknowledge and build upon what came before. The mixed reaction, 235 points, but with all these criticisms, tells you everything you need to know. People want this to succeed. They want better shader education tools, but this particular implementation, it's got some work to do before it can claim its place alongside the established resources in the shader education world.
Speaking of graphics and visual processing, let's move from virtual shaders to real-world imaging with a photography technique that's blowing people's minds. And it involves trains, industrial cameras, and a completely different way of thinking about what a photograph even is. Story 4. Line scan camera image processing for train photography. All right, now let's dive into something that's both incredibly niche and absolutely fascinating. Line scan camera image processing for train photography. This one really caught the Hacker News crowd's attention with over 230 points, and honestly, once you understand what's happening here, you'll see why everyone's geeking out about it. So picture this. You're trying to photograph a train, right? But instead of using a normal camera that captures everything in one rectangular frame, you're using something called a line scan camera that only has like 1 or 2 columns of pixels, just a single vertical strip, and it's scanning thousands of times per second as the train whooshes by. What you end up with is this mind-bending image where the horizontal axis isn't showing you left to right in space. It's showing you the passage of time. Each column of pixels in your final image represents a different moment as the train passed through that narrow scanning zone. The photographer behind this project is creating these absolutely massive images. We're talking over 100,000 pixels wide, with incredible detail and virtually no perspective distortion. And that lack of distortion is key here. When you photograph a long train with a regular camera, you get all that converging perspective where the far end looks smaller. But with this technique, the entire train appears perfectly flat and uniform, like you're seeing every single car from the exact same angle. Model train enthusiasts and railway historians are apparently going nuts for this because you can see every rivet, every detail with scientific precision. What really gets me about this whole thing is that it's not even new technology. One commenter pointed out that photo finish cameras at the Olympics have been using this principle since 1953. But applying it to trains with modern digital sensors, that's where it gets interesting. The technical challenges are wild too. You've got to perfectly calibrate your scanning speed to match the train's velocity. Otherwise, your image gets stretched or compressed. One person in the comments mentioned the speed estimation could be off by like 10%, which when you're dealing with these massive resolutions, that's a lot of pixels to account for.
And here's where it gets really trippy. Anything that's not moving, like the background landscape or platform, it just gets repeated over and over, creating these surreal striped patterns behind the train. It's like the camera only cares about change, about movement. Static objects become these abstract, repeating textures, while the moving subject stays crystal clear. The Hacker News discussion went deep into the rabbit hole on this one. People were sharing all sorts of related experiments. Someone mentioned using drones with line scan cameras to photograph entire forests of trees. Others talked about hacking flatbed scanners to work as cameras. There's this whole underground community of people experimenting with time-based imaging that I had no idea existed. Now, not everyone was completely sold on the results.
There was this interesting critique from one commenter who felt the denoising algorithm was actually making things worse, creating unnatural artifacts instead of cleaning up the image. They suggested just turning it off entirely and embracing the raw sensor data. It's a fair point. Sometimes in pursuit of technical perfection, we can process the soul right out of an image. But what really struck me reading through all of this is how it represents this beautiful intersection of industrial technology and artistic expression. These line scan cameras are typically used for quality control on factory conveyor belts, checking for defects in products as they zip by. Someone mentioned they're huge in food processing, sorting good apples from bad ones at incredible speeds. And here's this photographer who looked at this purely functional industrial tool and thought, hey, what if I pointed it at trains? The technical deep dive in the article is worth checking out too. It goes into how the image processing works, the challenges of demosaicing when you're dealing with this unique capture method, and all the ways you can mess it up if you're not careful. But beyond the tech specs, what I love is how it makes you rethink what a photograph even is. We're so used to thinking of photos as these frozen moments in time, but this technique creates images that are more like temporal cross-sections, where one dimension is pure time.
It makes you wonder what other vintage photographic techniques are just sitting there, waiting to be rediscovered and reimagined with modern sensors and processing power. The conversation in the comments was full of people sharing their own experiments and discoveries, and you can feel this excitement about pushing the boundaries of what imaging can be. That's the magic of the Hacker News community right there. You post about photographing trains in a weird way, and suddenly you've got dozens of engineers and artists sharing insights about everything from Olympic timing systems to industrial conveyor belt sensors. And finally, let's wrap up with a story that really encapsulates a lot of the themes we've been touching on today. The tension between proprietary and open source, the trade-offs between polish and freedom, and what happens when a developer decides they've had enough of playing by someone else's rules. All right, now we're diving into something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News crowd. From M1 MacBook to Arch Linux, a month-long experiment that became permanent. This one pulled in over 400 comments, and honestly, after reading through them, I can see why it hit such a nerve. So here's the setup. We've got a developer who's been in the Apple ecosystem for 15 years, right? They're running this powerhouse M1 Max MacBook Pro, which, let's be real, that's not a cheap machine. We're gawking, what, $4 or $5 grand when it was new? And they just said, you know what? I'm done. I'm switching to a budget Lenovo ThinkBook running Arch Linux. And the kicker is, they're not going back. What really fascinates me about the story is why they switched. It wasn't the hardware failing. The M1 Max is still an absolute beast of a chip. No, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts with macOS. Their window manager, Yabai, stopped working properly after some update. They're getting constantly interrupted by system update prompts. And they realized they were paying for all these apps through SetApp. Things like Bartender for menu bar management, various VPN tools that have perfectly good, often better, open-source alternatives on Linux. The author went with something called Omarchy, which is basically Arch Linux with some nice defaults. And here's where it gets interesting. They're saying this cheap Lenovo ThinkBook with an AMD processor is giving them comparable performance to their M1 Max for their actual development work. That's a bold claim. And it really challenges this narrative we've all kind of accepted that you need top-tier hardware to be productive as a developer. Now, the comments section is where this gets spicy. You've got basically two camps forming, and they're both making compelling arguments. On one side, you have the Linux converts who are like, yes, finally someone gets it. The freedom, the customization, no more Apple telling you what you can and can't do with your own machine. These folks are tired of what they see as Apple's increasingly restrictive ecosystem, the quality control issues with recent macOS updates, and, let's be honest, the price tags. But then you've got the other camp coming in hot with reality checks. They're pointing out that battery life on Linux laptops is still nowhere near what you get with Apple Silicon. One commenter mentioned their fan is constantly spinning on their Linux machine while their MacBook stays silent even under load. And there's this recurring theme about the time investment. People saying they spent their 20s tweaking Linux configs, but now they just want something that works out of the box.
There's this really interesting comment from a user called Psychomaniac who pushes back on the whole MacBooks last forever narrative. They're saying, look, I've had ThinkPads running for 8, 10 years with no issues. And when something does break, I can actually fix it myself instead of paying Apple's repair prices or, worse, being told it's not repairable. Another user, PJMLP, made this observation that kind of cuts to the heart of it. They said these switchers were never really Apple users in the first place. They were just using Macs as pretty Unix machines, running terminal, VS Code, and a browser. If that's all you're doing, yeah, maybe you don't need to pay the Apple tax. What strikes me most about this whole discussion is how it really highlights where we are in 2024 with development machines. The hardware has gotten so good across the board that for many developers, the differentiator isn't raw performance anymore. It's the software experience and philosophy. Are you willing to trade some polish and integration for freedom and customizability? Are you okay with occasionally having to pop open a config file to fix something if it means you're not locked into one company's vision of how you should use your computer? And there's this underlying current in the discussion about Apple's software quality that I think deserves attention. Multiple commenters are saying macOS isn't the it just works paradise it used to be. Between breaking changes and updates, aggressive push notifications for services, and things like Stage Manager that nobody asked for, some longtime Mac users are feeling like Apple's lost the plot a bit.
The battery life thing, though, that's still the Linux Achilles heel. Several commenters who've tried to make the switch mentioned this as the deal breaker. When you're used to getting 12, 14 hours on an M1 MacBook, dropping down to 5 or 6 hours on Linux, even with all the power management tweaks, that's rough if you're someone who works from coffee shops or travels a lot. But here's what I think is the real takeaway from this story and the discussion around it. We're at this interesting inflection point where choosing an operating system and hardware platform is becoming more about philosophy and workflow preferences than pure technical requirements. The fact that a developer can switch from a premium M1 Max machine to a budget laptop and be productive, that tells you something about how far the budget options have come. Whether that switch makes sense for you, well, that depends on what trade-offs you're willing to make. Outro. And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a fascinating collection, right? From the open source drama around Manim's competing forks, to developers trying to break free from walled gardens with Librebox, to photographers reimagining industrial cameras as artistic tools, and finally, that dramatic breakup between a longtime Mac user and their M1 MacBook. What really ties all these stories together is this underlying theme of developers and creators taking control of their tools and workflows. Whether it's forking an animation library to make it more accessible, building escape hatches from proprietary platforms, or switching from a premium laptop to a budget machine running Linux, that tells you something about how far the budget options have come. Whether that switch makes sense for you, well, that depends on what trade-offs you're willing to make. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. Remember, these were just the top 5 stories out of 30 that crossed our desk, selected based on the incredible discussions they generated. If you want to dive deeper into any of these topics, head over to Hacker News and join the conversation. Until tomorrow, keep hacking, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. This has been your daily Hacker News podcast. See you next time.